I've been noticing something recently that I think is easy to overlook. Many thoughtful people spend a surprising amount of time evaluating themselves, not necessarily in obvious ways. Sometimes it's after a conversation. You replay what you said. You wonder whether you handled it well. Sometimes it's after a difficult emotion. You find yourself asking yourself why you reacted that way. Sometimes it can simply be the quiet question, how am I doing? Am I growing enough? Am I becoming the person I think I should be? Am I making enough progress? And none of these questions are unreasonable. In fact, they can seem like signs of maturity, signs that you're paying attention to your life. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with reflecting on yourself. But I do wonder whether a subtle shift can happen without us noticing. A point where reflection becomes ongoing evaluation, not something we occasionally do, but something that quietly becomes the background activity of our relationship with ourselves. It's interesting because when I first started noticing this, I began seeing it in places where I hadn't expected. An awkward conversation becomes something to assess. A difficult day becomes something to interpret. An uncertain feeling becomes something to explain. A moment of unease becomes another question to answer. And over time, it can seem perfectly normal, almost as if every experience naturally arrives with an invitation to evaluate yourself through it. How did I handle that? What does this say about me? What still needs work? And I wonder whether this is where something important begins to change. Because there's a difference between having an experience and immediately turning that experience into information about yourself. The distinction may seem small, but the consequences aren't small at all. If experiences we go through are seen as occasions for self-evaluation, something begins to shift. The very relationship with ourselves begins to organize around assessment, around measurement, around interpretation. You're not simply someone going through experiences. You're continually asking what those experiences reveal about you. Now again, I want to be very careful here. I'm not suggesting that self-reflection is a problem, nor am I suggesting that understanding yourself is somehow unhealthy. No, I'm not pointing to that. I'm pointing to something much narrower, the possibility that continual self-evaluation quietly changes the way you inhabit your life. Because if you're repeatedly evaluating yourself, it's very easy for your attention to become drawn toward what still needs improvement, what still needs understanding, what still feels unresolved. And once this becomes familiar, a new pattern can quietly emerge. The feeling of unease appears, and attention naturally turns towards yourself. Not because you've consciously decided to do that, but because that's become the established pattern. The feeling appears, then the evaluation begins. What does this mean? Why am I feeling this way? What does this reveal? What still needs work? And if ordinary unease has already been interpreted as evidence that something must be wrong, missing, or deficient, then self-evaluation can very easily become part of the project of trying to solve it. Not because evaluation itself is wrong, but because it's happening inside a much larger assumption. The assumption that the feeling is pointing towards something that needs to be corrected about yourself. And when I first started to notice this, an interesting question started to emerge. What if the issue isn't simply how accurately you evaluate yourself? What if the deeper issue is how much of our relationship with ourselves is being shaped by this self-evaluation? Because when evaluation becomes constant, it's difficult to ever feel entirely finished. There's almost always another conversation to think about, another reaction to understand, another habit to improve, another feeling to interpret, another part of yourself that seems to deserve attention. And after a while, this can seem less like something you're doing and more like simply the way life is. But perhaps that's precisely what makes it so difficult to notice. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's become ordinary. So perhaps the question isn't, how do I become better at evaluating myself? The more interesting question is, what happens when evaluation itself quietly becomes the way I relate to myself? And that's something I've been thinking about, and something we'll definitely continue to explore on this channel together.